First, mark the center front of the skirt clearly. Now, wherever there is a pen, use chalk or a very fine ink pen to mark where the pen is so you can pull the pins out. Be sure to do both sides. Doing the same thing with the darts. Marking center back very clearly. Marking the bottom of the dart and up the dart legs where the pins are so I can take the pins out. Of course, you're going to have a bump at the bottom of the dart until you take the pins out and the fabric can lay flat. Now I'm going to true everything up. Using some sort of curve, connect from the waist down through the bottom of the skirt. We'll refine these lines as we work through the pattern. From the hip down, a straight ruler is more practical. Now I'm simply adding seam allowance. On this particular pattern, I'm adding 3/4 of an inch seam allowance so that after I true the pattern or the muslin pattern up, I can then put it back together and check the fit on the model. Finding the dead center of the dart, measuring from the center back to that center to see what it is. And in this case, it's a little bit before 4 inches. So I'm drawing a straight line parallel to center back for the dead center of the dart. Then I can draw the 2 dart legs on either side of the center dart leg. Folding this dart as if I'm going to sew it. Folding down the center, pinning the legs together, making sure that they're right on top of each other. and finger pressing the dart towards the center back. From the center back, for at least 1/2 inch into the skirt, you want a line perpendicular to center back at the waist. And then using the curve, I'm going to make a smooth transition in the waistline between those markings. Marking the seam allowance, which will be 1/2 inch along the waistline. Using the curve to refine it. Making sure there are no pins in the way before I use my scissors, and cut the top of the seam allowance. Now you can see it looks pretty much like a pattern. Writing the amount of the seam allowance of the dart on either side of the center dart leg. In this case, I've made it 5/8 inch. And this particular dart is about 4 3/4 inches long. You'll find that the darts are determined by the shape of the body. If a person has buttocks that start very high and full, chances are you'll need a fuller dart at the top and a shorter dart. In this case, a longer dart is appropriate. On to the front piece. Simply removing the ribbon that was used for the waistband. Going over the pins with a pencil so I can take the pins out. Marking the side waist. Finding the width of the top of the dart and marking the dead center. And now finding the distance between that and the center front line of the skirt so I can make a line parallel to the center front for the middle dart leg. There you go, that's the middle dart leg. Marking the bottom of the dart, double checking for each side leg, and marking appropriately. Taking my curve and connecting the dots of the pencil lines that replaced the pins. I want to check the width because really on Rosa, on this particular skirt, the widest part of her body is at the hip. So the skirt sloper needs to be straight from the hip down. So that measurement across the hip, the blue line that's perpendicular to the center front or center back, can be parallel from the hip down to the center front or center back. Folding and pinning the dart as if I'm sewing it. pressing it with my fingers towards the center, in this case center front, and pinning it down securely below the waistline. If you do it above the waistline, you're likely to accidentally cut into the pin with your scissors, and that will damage the blade of the scissors. The center front at the waist needs to be absolutely perpendicular to the center front line. And now drawing the waistline in, adding my seam allowance, and down the side seam allowance, pushing that pin down to make sure I don't cut into it and destroy my blade. Now I have half of this sloper in muslin prepared. Still have a little refining, but I'll need to at some point put all these markings on the other side of the muslin as well. I'm marking my notches, center front, darts, side seam at the waist, and hips. Same thing in the back. Hip, down the side seam, top of the darts, and center back. My center back seam allowance is 1 inch. This can be sewn back together and used again and again for different reasons later on. What I'm doing now is transferring the marked side of the back muslin to the other side. In other words, now I need 2 backs. First, I pinned the back center seam together. I'm checking the hip lines to make sure they're connected. And then just pin it down securely. In this case, I'm just going to snip 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch into the notches so that when I mark the notches on the other side or need a mark, they're in the exact same place as the top layer. Where the pin went in at the bottom of the dart, I put a little X, and I usually circle it just because it helps my eye get to it faster. And now using that, I want to connect all of the legs of the dart. I connect the bottom of the dart to that little snip at the top of the notch on both legs. And find the dead center. I also marked the seam or the intake at the dart top. I'm marking the 1/2 inch of the seam allowance. I also usually write what the seam allowance is. In this case, 1/2 of an inch at the top and 3/4 of an inch down the sides. Hip notch, marking center back, waist notch at center back. Basically repeating the process for the front. Folding along the center front line. Making sure the hip line connects. As you see, I marked the bottom tip of the dart, pinned it together, and am cutting it out so that I can flip it over and transfer all the markings from the right side to the left side. Snipping the top of the dart where the notches are, the side seam at the waist notch, marking the bottom tip of the dart, Marking the dart legs. Marking the center leg of the dart. And marking the intake on each side. 1/2 inch on each side, a total of 1 inch. 1/2 inch seam allowance across the waistband and 3/4 of an inch down the side seam. Marking the notches, hip, side seam at the waist, darts, and center front. Now I'm checking the side length measurement. I want to make sure that they're both front and back are exactly the same in length so that they sew together properly. I'm also measuring the hemline to make sure it's the same from front to back. When you drape something, because it's fabric and fabric stretches and is manipulative, when you take that muslin and put it to paper, you have to really check your measurements carefully because the final sloper in pattern, paper, or oak tag must be exact so that when you go to create styles, everything falls together perfectly. So I'm just basically comparing the lengths of the side seams, the hem lengths to make sure it's all perfect. Pinning the hem up. So we can take a look at it. I'm putting the side seams together. The center front is at the very top, and the center back is at the very bottom, and the side seams that are sewn together meet in the middle. Looks pretty good. Okay, so what I've done is show you 3/4 inch seam allowances match, and then the center back and the center front are at opposite ends. Now, so that I can make a pattern for an A-line skirt, I need to trace this into a pattern sloper without seam allowance. The muslin can be saved for a later date if I want to refit the model or see if her body's changed. I can use this muslin over and over by basting or sewing it together. But for manipulating a style, I need to have this particular shape of a skirt, front and back only, one side each, half the front, half the back, in paper that I can slash and spread or manipulate in other ways without any seam allowance. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to trace off the skirt with the darts and no hem and no seam allowance. You always want a very, very sharp pencil. For film purposes, I usually use a darker pencil, but if you're at home working, a harder lead is usually better because you can get a finer line. Marking the hip line. The model's name so that I keep my slopers in the right order for the right model, and center back so that I don't get this confused with my center front piece. I folded the dart and I'm cutting along the waistline to get the proper shape. That little mark that I just did shows that there's a perpendicular line between the top of the waist and down the center. Hip line, model's name. Center front. Filling in the dart legs, the center line of the dart. a right angle at center front, marking the bottom of the dart, folding the dart, first down the center of the dart, and then towards the center front. The back I really only folded, but you're going to get a truer read if you pin it like this. You can fill it in with your curved ruler, or if you feel confident enough with your cutting, you can cut right along those dotted lines. Now let's compare. I'm putting the two hip lines together. And because the front and back darts may be somewhat different, the angle of the shape from hip to waist may be slightly different, but the length needs to be exactly the same. So I'm adjusting accordingly. So from hip to waistline, the distance is the same. And I need to do the same at the hemline. Double check that hemline to make sure that it's from the same from hip to hemline. I want to make sure that that width from hip, from the center front to the hip is the same. In other words, that the side seam from the hip to the hem is parallel to the center front line. And mine was a little bit off. Sometimes it's much more easily seen in paper than in fabric. I can see that that top layer has a little bit of a curve from the hip line down to the hem. So I'll adjust that in a moment. But for now, I'm adjusting the hem length, or the length from the hip to the hemline. So now let's measure again on this piece from the center to the hip on the side. Whatever that measurement is, it needs to be a parallel line down the side from the hip line down, parallel from center front to side seam. It's slight, but that slight difference will make all the difference when you go to make your pattern. There it is. Now, from the hip to the hemline is parallel. Okay, so now I've put these side seams together. The center front is to your right and the center back is to your left. I do see that I have not trimmed off the excess of the hem on the center front. So let's get those two hip lines aligned. There they are. And check down at the hem. My back piece is a little bit shorter than the front, and that you can see there. And now they need to be the same. And now we have a paper sloper.